Our last would be a pandemic event or pandemic disease. And this is something that goes global. So you're going to find it, of course, worldwide. So it's going to be on, there's not really a formula, but what's to say, at least 2 continents, maybe 3 would be probably a proper requirement. But it just has to be something you find all throughout the world. Some examples. Previous examples is the swine flu or H1N1. And I'll talk about that one with a specific example here soon. HIV/AIDS, we can find it on every continent. It's something in which it might be declining in certain areas of the world, but is definitely found all throughout the world. Now, Ebola. This is one that's recently been in the news. Is it a pandemic disease? Not really, but kind of, sort of. But we'll use that as an example of, once again, all 3 of these terms, endemic, epidemic, and pandemic. But it pretty much is not. It's pretty much just found in one part of the world. If we go back to chapter 1, I talked about different types of diffusion. This means the spread of different ideas, the spread of information, the spread of knowledge, the spread of fashion trends, but it can also be the spread of diseases. So I'm going to come back and use those terms, specifically contagious diffusion, hierarchical diffusion, and network diffusion. Contagious diffusion, the idea here, drop a coin in a fountain, it spreads all outward in all directions from wherever that coin hit the water surface. So the idea there is saying spread outwardly from a source area. So we could think of contagious diffusion, the flu. And so, for example, elementary kids, they'll often pass the flu around. So it's contagious diffusion. It spreads throughout that population, and it spreads quite quickly. Hierarchical diffusion, the idea there is places that matter, big cities, places that have maybe more airports, big airports, going to be moving people, are going to have more clout, but also more travelers. And the spread of a disease might then spread via airline networks that spread to these big capital areas, big cities that spread throughout outward areas from there. But meanwhile, rural areas, remote areas that aren't connected to that hierarchy, that are kind of rural, far off and distant, they might not have that disease, or the disease might take a much longer time for it to get there. So the idea of things spread from cities of power, big places, to eventually to small places. Network diffusion there, a good example is for the pornography industry there in the 1970s to 1980s. Huge outbreak of STDs, and so it's a good example of it being endemic to a population. But what happened was it became an epidemic because it spread throughout all pornographers because of unprotected sex and not knowing the do's and don'ts and all of that. And so you could say amongst that network, amongst that group of people, the disease and the STDs spread quite quickly. But if you're not in the pornography industry, you had obviously much less likely chance of having that disease. So we think about network diffusion. It's often groups of people, networks of people, people who interact with each other. We can also use that as an example when we think about the IUPUI campus that has had a mumps outbreak, that's had a tuberculosis outbreak. Network diffusion, who those people come into contact with, is absolutely important because that could be the people who might have a tuberculosis or mumps that might have been passed on from a person who's been diagnosed, a student who's been diagnosed with it. So you see this on college campuses a lot, network diffusion in terms of spreading these diseases, these infectious diseases, and we always see this here in Indianapolis, at IUPUI or Butler, typically in the wintertime. So those would be meth. I mean, who uses meth? I mean, it's typically people who know each other. And so, people who become a network of people who start trading and selling and recreating with each other using meth. And so meth has its connotations and, its usages and its ailments, and it becomes obviously an addiction, which is a disease. And so that is an example of network diffusion, spreading that meth culture amongst people who know each other. So all these types of diffusion we can then further use to explain how diseases spread, and eventually, heaven forbid, they become a pandemic, we can understand how they got to that point. So a good example of a pandemic would be the swine or H1N1 flu from 2009. We can see all throughout the world, numerous continents, this particular disease was found. And just to help you out with the colors, if it's dark color, if it's colored black, it means it's present, the H1N1. If it's red, it means it's pretty much assumed it was there. And if it's gray, no, it's not there, or there's no data. And so what this gets to, once again, is hierarchical diffusion. We look at those stage 2 countries, throughout much of Africa, good amount of Asia, even parts of Eastern Europe, in which they're a little bit less developed. So subsequently, they're not hooked up to the global economy, the airports, and all the global transportation of products and whatnot. And so the H1N1 takes a little bit longer time, if it even does spread to more remote, those smaller places, let's say. HIV, good example of a pandemic. So who cares what the colors mean? You can see in the regions, the smallest one, it looks like the Eastern Mediterranean. I don't know, only 280,000 people. So there's no doubt HIV is a pandemic. It's found everywhere. I've talked about tuberculosis beforehand. It's actually an example of a receding pandemic. And so you can have things that become global, but over time become less global. And so this is an example of a receding or a declining pandemic. It used to be found all throughout the world in much higher rates, but it's much less now, much less common. Now let's talk about Ebola, something that's been relatively recently in the news. When was the first Ebola outbreak? This happened, 2013, 14, 15, somewhere in there. Actually, no. Ebola's been around since 1976 is the earliest known diagnosis of someone with Ebola. So here we have something that's been around for a long time. And in fact is endemic to a specific area of Western Africa, in the country of Guinea. So Ebola has been endemic for years in a very specific, very remote area of Western Africa. However, recently it became an epidemic. Why? Because of the spreading via contagious diffusion to other areas beyond that endemic, small, remote area. Ebola, as far as how it got to humans, it's believed it got to humans from bats. There's a really, really remote rural group that lives in Guinea, and they eat bats. And so it's believed that's how it then got from parasite to host, and then started to spread over a long period of time. Keep in mind, it's been around since the 1970s. Then spread via contagious diffusion to other areas in Western and Central Africa, and then became what maybe would be considered a pandemic, which it was found in more areas of the world as hierarchical diffusion, as people then migrated to New York City, moved to China, moved to Italy. And so essentially it was a pandemic, but a lot of those movements was people who were working, trying to help get rid of the Ebola, who are from these various countries, these stage 4 countries, and essentially they were brought back to be quarantined, to be helped, to be tried to fix them of the Ebola virus. And so essentially it became a pandemic, but that was kind of controlled in the sense that they were brought back. It became a pandemic to help save these people's lives and to make them no longer have the Ebola virus. But is it considered a pandemic today? No. It's really not a pandemic. I don't think it really ever was. But there's no doubt it's still a problem. It still hasn't gone away, but it's become much more focused back there in Africa and Western and Central Africa especially.